This is going to be my first YouTube video. In it, I will be doing a summary of Letter from Birmingham Jail, which is a famous letter written by Martin Luther King after being arrested for protesting against segregation laws in Birmingham. So, without any further delay, I'm going to get into the presentation. Wait for it to load up a little bit here. Okay, so some background. At this time, as I mentioned, King had been arrested for protesting against segregation laws in Birmingham. While in prison, he receives a letter from eight religious leaders, and in this letter, they're expressing their concern and caution over King's tactics and his nonviolent direct action. King acknowledges that he typically would not respond to criticism, but seeing as he was in prison, he had a lot of time on his hands, and he felt like he needed to get a lot off of his chest. So he writes this letter, which ends up being known as the Letter from Birmingham Jail. So there are four parts to the Letter from Birmingham Jail. The first part is where King addresses criticism, specifically criticism that he's an outside agitator, an extremist, and has failed to negotiate or reach a resolution through negotiation. The second part is where King establishes a framework for the nonviolent movement. The third part is where King introduces and defines just versus unjust laws and why it is our duty to disobey unjust laws. The fourth part of Letter from Birmingham Jail is where King expresses his disappointment with certain groups, mainly two groups, white moderates and white churches. He also addresses unfounded praise that was going around at the time for the Birmingham police. So those are the four parts, and I've broken up my presentation into those four parts. So let's get started here. So first, King addresses criticisms. The first criticism he addresses is that he's an outside agitator. For King, this argument is irrelevant, but it's irrelevant, one, because the existence of injustice alone gives him a moral duty to be in Birmingham. But if that wasn't enough, King goes on to stress the interconnectedness of all states and communities, meaning that what happens to one person indirectly affects another person. This is where he develops his famous quote, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. In addition to this, he says, look, I have ties in Birmingham. At the time, he was the civil rights leader, and he states that he had been operating with and working with 85 affiliate groups operating all throughout the South. So if the presence of injustice wasn't a reason enough to be there, King also cites that, look, I have ties. And as a leader of the civil rights movement working with these ties, I also have a right to be here. So that is how King addresses that first argument or criticism that he's an outside agitator. The second criticism is that he's an extremist. At the beginning, King acknowledges that he did not like being called an extremist because he saw himself as a mediator between two forces. One force who had been so battered by oppression that they had become disillusioned with the prospect of change, so they sought refuge in more Black nationalist movements. Whereas the other faction was the one embracing King's nonviolent campaign. And so for King, he's standing in between both of these groups as a mediator. So to be called an extremist initially bothered King. But after he thought about it, King came to the conclusion that history very often is changed by extremists. So King embraces the idea of being an extremist. And on the next slide, I just want to show you a quote here. This is from the Letter from Birmingham Jail, but King says, was Jesus not an extremist in love? Was Martin Luther not an extremist? Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God. Was Paul Bunyan not an extremist? I will stay in jail until the end of my days before I make a mockery of my conscience. Was Abraham Lincoln not an extremist? This nation cannot survive half slave and half free. Was Thomas Jefferson not an extremist? We hold these truths to be self evident that all men are created equal. So for King, being called an extremist, although it initially bothered him, he realized that history is often changed by extremists, so he embraces it. The last criticism he addresses is his lack of ability to negotiate or reach a resolution before entering in his nonviolent campaign. And to this end, King says that history is a tragic tale of the power structure never voluntarily giving up their power or granting rights. Um, in addition to this, King states that he has tried to negotiate. As I mentioned beforehand, he had been protesting uh, in regards to segregation laws. So, one of the points in the negotiation was that business leaders would have to take down their racial signs. They initially agreed to it, but no business leader ended up following through. So, for King, number one, oppressors very few times voluntarily give up their position as the oppressor. And two, he had engaged in negotiation, but they had not met their end of the bargain. So that is what precipitates King entering into his nonviolent direct action. So that's the first part there. There's the extremist quote again. The second part of King's work in Letter from Birmingham Jail is his framework for a nonviolent campaign. So King states that there are four requirements to any nonviolent campaign. First, you must collect the facts to determine whether injustice exists. Second, you must negotiate or attempt negotiation. Third, you must begin self purification. And fourth, then you engage in nonviolent direct action. So to go back a little bit, number one, King had gathered the facts regarding what was going on in Birmingham. In his letter, he talks about Birmingham being quite possibly the most segregated city, where the unjust treatment of blacks was a harsh reality. So for King, unequivocally, um, injustices were being committed in Birmingham. The second part, as I mentioned, negotiation. King tried to negotiate regarding the segregation laws, trying to get business leaders to take down their signs or trying to get some assistance from the government. But this failed. They did not keep up their end of the bargain, and the power structure wasn't listening to King. So that brought him to the third step. After negotiations failed, it's a process King calls self purification, which I would describe it as um, getting yourself mentally prepared for the consequences of nonviolent direct action. Asking yourself, are you willing to go to jail? Are you willing to be hurt without responding? Are you willing to accept blows without retaliating? And for King, this process is extremely important. Self purification. This process is extremely important because it puts you in the right mental state to then engage in nonviolent direct action, which could result in you going to jail and losing your liberty, or worse. At this time, there was a lot of police brutality, maybe being hurt, broken limbs. But in any event, self purification involved mentally preparing yourself for the consequences of nonviolent direct action. Now, um, arguably one of the most famous parts in this letter is his definition of nonviolent direct action. And on the next slide, I have a little bit more here to describe it. But what is nonviolent direct action? This could come in the form of mass breaking of unjust laws, sit-ins, protests, marches. But the goal of nonviolent direct action is to create a level of tension and crisis around an issue so that a community is forced to look at something that it has been refusing to look at. So, put another way, the purpose is to create a situation so crisis packed that a community is forced to look at an issue it has been ignoring. The goal for King, the goal is always resolution. But Hopefully, when the power structure does not engage in negotiation or attempts to resolve, hopefully this nonviolent direct action can create the tension that paves the way to negotiation and resolution. Um, Lastly, another point is that King uses Socrates as an example. I felt it a good example when looking at his overall framework here, especially with nonviolent direct action. Socrates sought to create this tension when he taught his pupils, and this tension served uh, to make his pupils critically think, critically always ask why, so that they would have an objective basis for looking at any issue. Similarly, King wants to create that type of tension, but not in the mind. Well, in the mind, but mostly within society, within organized society, so that a community can look at itself critically and have an objective basis. So third, this is probably the biggest part in King's letter from Birmingham Jail, which is what is a just and unjust law, and why is there a duty to disobey an unjust law? So for King, and I'm going to go to this next slide for a second here. So these are two quotes from Letter from Birmingham Jail. Uh, King defines just laws as ones that square with that of moral law, whereas unjust laws are not rooted in eternal and natural law. Um, King makes it clear that he is looking for his God given, constitutionally protected rights. So he mentions natural law. Natural law would end up becoming the basis of the American Constitution. And in that, it states that we're granted inalienable rights given to us by a higher power. Code does not um, square with that moral law, with natural law, then that's an unjust law. Um, Put another way, and this is one of the more complicated parts in his letter. Put another way, um, a just law uplifts human personality, and in this respect, he uses segregation to show that it's unjust. Where because segregation degrades the personality, it degrades uh, the people being segregated, and it gives the people segregating a false sense of superiority. So, in this context, segregation is an unjust law. And as I mentioned beforehand, King mentions natural law, and I think this is very important because it embodies Locke's theories, which would end up becoming a deep basis for the Constitution. And King, in his other arguments, references the Constitution multiple times. Now, why do I say that? So, natural law is inalienable rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. These are rights given to us by a higher power. So when our life, liberty, protection of property is being threatened by man-made forces or by the state, then it's going against one, God, and two, the Constitution. So for King, an unjust law is one that goes against natural law, which is inalienable rights, God given rights to life, liberty, and the protection of property. And so a law becomes unjust when it starts to violate that. And he's vague also in contrast with just laws, but it appears that any law is just until it degrades human personality, until it you know, strays into the realm of violating natural law. So that's his third part there. And again, here are the quotes from Letter from Birmingham Jail on just and unjust laws. So, as I mentioned beforehand, a big point that King makes is it is our duty to break unjust laws. Because unjust laws violate natural, inalienable law, it violates the Constitution because natural law ends up becoming the basis for the Constitution. So for King, as American citizens, if we want to see America live up to that creed, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with inalienable rights. If we want to live up to that creed, then American citizens have to hold the government accountable when it denies to protect or grant these inalienable rights that are codified in the Constitution. So King makes it not only a moral duty because they're inalienable coming from a higher power. So in that aspect, he makes it going against God, and two, as a moral duty. So he makes it a moral duty and a civic duty. So his last part addresses white moderates and white churches and disappointment uh, with praise for the police. So regarding white moderates, um, the main criticism that King has here, or disappointment with white moderates, is that he had hoped they would reject the notion that time would inevitably bring change. One, King cites one example where one of his fellow brothers and sisters had written to him saying that um, you, your rights will be granted in time if you just wait. And so for King, um, time is neutral. Very few times in history has change been effectuated by the inevitability of time. Very often, change only comes through tireless, hard work um, by dedicated individuals willing to challenge the status quo, willing to challenge the power structure. So the main criticism and disappointment he has with white moderates is that they've embraced that the concept that time will eventually bring rights and protection of rights. And this is one of my favorite quotes. King says, "Justice delayed is often justice denied." And secondly, he addresses white churches. King, as a person who had been raised with church morals, as a person who was an active preacher, um, a person who was working with several affiliate churches, felt it a need to address the complacency of white churches. King had hoped that white churches would actually come um, to his aid a little bit more rather than criticize him. And one thing that King touches on is the sacrificial spirit, the early sacrificial spirit of the Christian church. Early Christians willing to brave mutilations or being fed to lions um, in protest to Nebuchadnezzar's unjust laws. Um, Early Christians that would not focus so much on themselves as much as the suffering of others. And so King notes this sacrificial spirit and asserts that the white church has not been practicing it. That often he has seen the white church. And these are pretty scathing words, but he says that they hide. Often he's seen them hide behind stained glass windows while preaching irrelevancies and trivialities in the face of injustices. Um, so King, as I said, doesn't offer this criticism as from the perspective of a person who dislikes the church. He's offering this criticism as a person who finds him deeply spiritual, deeply religious, a person who was raised in the arms of the church. So, although scathing, it is worth noting that King himself is a very religious person. Um, so the last part here is King addressing his disappointment with praise for the Birmingham police. He had seen many people or articles giving praise to the Birmingham police for maintaining the peace. Uh, for King, he had hoped that people would actually not praise the police but commend the protesters for their courage, for their willingness to suffer for civil rights. Moreover, he says that if these people had seen the brutality unleashed by the police, um, them beating on women and children protesters, um, police brutality in the jail cells. Had they seen the police and their actions, then he believes people would not have been so quick to praise the Birmingham police. So King, that was the last point that King really wanted to address in his letter from Birmingham jail. So with that said, those are the four main parts to his letter. For me, in conclusion, the importance of Letter from Birmingham Jail cannot be understated. It is crucial in forming the modern framework for any civil rights movement. It has been mimicked by leaders all across the world ever since King wrote this letter and engaged in his own. So he didn't only write, but engaged in what he wrote. King, this letter is monumental for its contribution to political philosophy, to its contribution to the civil rights movement, to its contribution for anybody trying to effectuate change. So, in conclusion, I really recommend that you look at this letter at some point. But I really enjoyed it, and I hope that this summary helps you out in some way. Thank you. References. If you like the video or want to see more content like this, just please like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate that. Take care, everybody.